Thanks, James. So hi, everybody. I'm Paul Appleby. I'm one of the co-founders of Graphifi, along with Ravinder, who's also on the call. So just a quick 30 seconds about who Graphifi are. We are a startup. We've been going 2 years. The first 18 months of that was spent building our two products. Graphologi is one, the other is EasyGraph, and they serve different purposes. So as James mentioned, Graphologi is around taxonomy and ontology management. EasyGraph is about knowledge graph delivery, and that works with triple stores such as MarkLogic. That's one for another call. So we've been around 2 years. We've been live since the end of last year, and Graphologi is what we're going to cover today. So one of the things we believe in is starting small, and I think James has already hinted that a knowledge graph is a journey, and so really the first part of that journey is what we're going to cover, creating some taxonomies, some ontologies, and just doing some basic stuff that will get you some solid foundations for moving forward. So starting small, get some value quickly. We hear a lot of people talking about the difficulty in maybe showing how this stuff has value. So a pilot, start small, do some taxonomies, and Graphologi is really geared up to help you do that kind of thing. It's a service, so you can simply go sign up and get going straight away, which is one of the barriers that we've been trying to break down, is to get people going quickly. So you don't need to spend a fortune up front. You can simply sign up and get going. So we'll build on some of the stuff that James mentioned on his slides, and there's a few basic steps that really James has already touched on, and those are using identifiers, and under the covers, Graphologi and MarkLogic, as one of its features, is RDF. So it's all RDF underneath the covers, which is semantic technology, and our identifiers are the backbone of that. And then we have taxonomies and ontologies, and using those with taxonomies, and then something called SCOLS XL, which is an extension to SCOLS that allows you to go a little bit further. So in the taxonomy world, there are certainly areas where taxonomies are not enough anymore, and we call it taxonomy plus plus. So ontologies and the standards behind them are fairly big beasts, and you don't necessarily need to know all about it to get some value from your ontologies. Some basic parts of the ontology can get you an awful long way, especially when you combine them with your ontologies. So we'll go through these steps and show how Graphologi can help you on each of these steps. So if we just switch a little bit more on identifiers. So James has already touched on identifiers, and you can see a couple of examples on screen. But I think just to reinforce the basic principle here, because it's foundation to all of this, is that an identifier and a URI or IRI is the point at the bottom on the screen. It allows you to unambiguously know what something is. So whether it's the concept of red or a product or anything that you can think of, it's a unique identifier for that thing, irrespective of language or anything else, essentially. And the form of your URI, to some degree, doesn't matter. There are pros and cons, and there are many approaches that you can take. You can see on screen, both of those could represent red quite happily. So for our examples today in Graphologi, we've set it up just to show some basic examples based around the idea that I want to buy a red T-shirt. Now that might sound very trivial, and obviously we're talking kind of in the area of maybe a shopping website or something like that. But there are some basic questions that people might need to ask of your website and your service, and it might be things like, well, I want red T-shirts. Well, what does red mean? To that customer and in your systems. What does T-shirt mean in the customer's language? Obviously, T-shirt is English. They might ask questions like, I want a crew neck T-shirt or a V-neck T-shirt. There are many different kinds of T-shirt. And then, of course, there are aspects such as the size and some of the features, such as, does it have long sleeves or short sleeves? And then potentially there are other aspects to it. Well, T-shirts aren't the only thing in your shopping catalogue. Potentially, there might be other items that you want to also connect together. So we use this as the basis of our demo, and And so we will switch at this point over to Graphology. Now, I'm running this on our development server, and this is a live demo, so fingers crossed. So when you plug into Graphology and you sign up, this is essentially what you see when you first go in. If you've got a subscription. So we have the two applications on the left, Vocabulary Manager and Ontology Manager. Dashboard is where permissions and user management are controlled, and then obviously you have the usual stuff like your account and obviously links off to the documentation. So Vocabulary Manager obviously is Taxonomies, Ontology Manager is Ontologies. So we will start by looking in the Vocabulary Manager, and everything in Graphology is based around a project, and you can have as many projects as you like in both Vocabulary Manager and Ontology Manager. And for today's purposes, we've set up one for this demo. So we'll go into that one. And once you're in a project, you can see that we have various things on display. A project can consist of as many taxonomies and collections as you like, and collections are another part of the SCOS standard, and we'll touch on those a bit more later. But yes, you could have one taxonomy, you could have many taxonomies. So in this instance, for this demo, we've created a handful of small taxonomies, but at the bottom, you might notice we've also imported the UNESCO thesaurus, which is an external taxonomy, quite a large one, that we've imported for today's demo. And you can essentially have as many in there as you need to for your purposes. So I say on the right, we've got collections, and they come in two different kinds, ordered and unordered collections, and we'll come back to those again later. So just one more slide for the moment. So our first problem, I guess, is what exactly do we mean by red? Now, obviously, color perception and all that stuff is a pretty complex area, but really what we're talking about here is the ability to know that maybe something in our shopping catalogue is red. If you look at those two pictures on screen, I ran them through a color detection algorithm, and they both came up as red. Now, that's up to the individual to argue whether they are red or not, but essentially, there may be a requirement in an automated system to do that kind of automated detection. We may need to obviously to present a set of colors on our shopping website. Most would have that as a filter when you're looking for an item of clothing. And so really we need to know that we're all talking about the same thing. And that's really one of the tricky parts in terms of language and technology. So switching back to the Vocabulary Manager. So you can see that we have a small color taxonomy in our system. So in our little universe of today, we only have 4 colors, so it's limited, but it serves the purpose, hopefully, of showing what we need. So if we click on red, and what you see is all of the detail about red. Now, all of these properties that you see are all from the standard SCOS model. It's a fairly big model and covers many use cases. But for our purposes, we're just going to show a few of the properties and features. So the first thing to note here is that we have our identifier for red, and this is the URI at the top. And we have 2 labels, one in red and one in rouge. So, or one in French, sorry, which is rouge. So that immediately gives us the ability to say what red means in various languages. And obviously, in a multinational company, you may need to present information in different languages depending on your user or their language or their location. You may also want to say that things are fairly similar. So here we've said actually that red and crimson are actually related. That they're probably fairly close in colour terms for most people. So that covers the language side of things, but on our slide we mentioned about maybe colour detection. Well, how do we define colour detection in this respect so that it's of use in an algorithm? Well, this is where we start to see the use of an ontology coming into our taxonomy, and we'll come back to the ontology a bit more. But what you can see at the bottom here is that we've defined a property called hex color. Now, in CSS, most people probably know that it's used for displaying websites and formatting websites, and colors are described in this way. And so this essentially is the hex value for red. And our color detection algorithm, for instance, may be able to use that in its processing, and then use this information to connect it back to our identifier. So whether it's a machine or people, we essentially can reference back to the same concept for the concept of red. So one of our other questions that we asked was, what kind of t-shirt? So if we go into the clothing taxonomy, you can see we have a small set of different kinds of clothing here. And down here we have t-shirt. Now, we've defined two narrower concepts of t-shirt, and if we click on the detail, we can see that on the right. So we have crew neck t-shirt and v-neck t-shirt as two possible, there are obviously many others, but there are two possible narrower, more specific concepts, more accurate definitions, you could argue, of what a t-shirt is. And narrower concepts is just one way to do this kind of thing. You could potentially use properties too. Some of the other interesting facts about what we're seeing on screen. Again, we have t-shirt in multiple languages. So in this instance, we have it in Italian, we have it in Russian. But obviously there are different ways of describing things in the same language. So t-shirt, but we also have lower down alternative labels, different ways of describing a t-shirt in a particular language. T-space shirt, t-shirt. This kind of information, I think, as James touched upon, this can be used for search, helping in search. So things like query expansion, or if somebody types in one of those alternative labels into a search, you can probably get your system to connect it back to the actual concept that is t-shirt. So there are many uses there in search expansion, in entity extraction, where these kind of things can help and give you back to the canonical concept that you're trying to work with. So other interesting things that we see on here is the related concept of genes. So we mentioned on our questions at the top, are there other things that we might want to connect to, potentially to suggest to a user or for various other reasons? And generally, I think most people would say, oh, t-shirts and genes quite often go together. So in our taxonomy, we've made that connection to say that t-shirts and genes are related. Now, this is using a SCOS relationship, and the SCOS relationships are powerful, but they are quite generic. It just means the two things are connected. We can't really say anything more than that using SCOS. But what we can do again is this is where we can start to use our ontology. So in our ontology, we have a property called related clothing, and so what we can say in a more precise way is that jeans are related to t-shirt as an item of related clothing. And the reason that we can connect it to jeans is because the property related clothing is defined as having a target of jeans, or sorry, of clothes. And if we click through to jeans, and hopefully everybody's still with me.
Yep.
Yeah, people still there. So here we are. Yeah, that's good. All I can see is my screen. So here we can see that we've gone through to jeans, and we can see that this is where another item from our ontology starts to come in. We've used the class of clothing. So it's not only a concept, it's also something that we've defined as an item of clothing. And that's how we managed to connect jeans to t-shirts via that property, because the property was defined as being connecting things that are clothing. And we can see similarly that the related concept goes back to t-shirt. That property is what's called symmetric. It goes both ways. And that's something you can define in an ontology, but that's part of the SCOS standard anyway. So classes, they can serve multiple purposes. They allow you to say, add properties, but they kind of add classification too. But there are many ways or approaches you can take to classifying in more detail. Classes are one approach, collections are another, and even more taxonomies. And people use different approaches for different use cases. There's no one right answer to how you do some of these things. So clothing is from our ontology. Let's go have a look. So if we click on clothing, we now have actually switched to the ontology manager, and the user experience is very similar. So and that's intentional. We want to make it easy for users to work around the application. So here we are in the ontology manager, looking at the definition of the clothing class that we were just using on jeans. And so we just have a few classes defined in our ontology: clothing, color, and country at the top level, and a subclass of clothing called upper body clothing. And obviously, an ontology is essentially, it defines your domain, your kind of business models, and it may be that upper body clothing has some value. So the ontology will be as complex or as simple as you need it to be for your business, essentially. And as James said, you may be able to find a third-party ontology, or you may need to build it yourself, or combine the two even. So we have some basic information about a class, and then we also have what we call object properties, which are the relationships that we've heard mentioned. If we click through there, we can see we've got a couple. So we've got the related clothing property that we used. And so here we can see that there are various things you can define about that property. And one of those is that the range of the property is clothing. So that defines the things that it connects to are items of clothing. And you can do a similar thing on the domain. And the domain is really used as to control which concepts the property appears on. So those two things can work together. But these are standard OWL properties and constructs that we're seeing on screen, and that's the basis of the ontology manager, is the OWL W3 standard. So the other kind of property we've got is data type properties, and these essentially have values. So we saw hex color, and here we've defined the hex color as, again, having the domain of color and a range. So again, that just controls more tightly where it appears in your concepts. So if we switch back to Vocabulary Manager project. So one of the other questions on our slide was about t-shirt size. And so we'll go into our taxonomy of clothing sizes. And as I said, you can create as many taxonomies as you need for your domain and your knowledge graph. And some people would put everything in one taxonomy, but it may be better to break them down in this way that we have here. It really does depend on your own situation. So we have clothing sizes, and we've just put a few in here, and these were typical clothing sizes that you might see. But you can see that there are various questions here. These are not in the order that you might want on, say, a website. The concepts, essentially just a bag of concepts. There's no order in the hierarchy other than the fact that we display them alphabetically. So one of the questions here is, well, how can we get those things into something more useful maybe for our website? And this is where collections come into play. And collections are maybe a slightly understated part of SCOS, but a very powerful part of it. So you can see here that our size medium is actually in the clothing sizes ordered collection, and it's even, we can tell us that it's in position 3. So if we go through to there, we're now into that collection. And if you look on the left, you can see that our sizes are now ordered in a more logical sense of how we might want to present this information to the users. But these are not copies of these concepts. These are exactly the same concepts with the same identifiers. We're just referencing them from a collection. So it's all a graph of connected things. And the collection is just one part of that graph, of your knowledge graph, just ordering certain things for a particular use case in this situation. So one more example of a collection. So that was an ordered collection. If we take countries as another example, and obviously many businesses will have their own list of countries that they need to deal with potentially. I mean, we're just got a small subset of countries here, but if we look at, for instance, Wales. So Wales is obviously part of the UK, but it's also a European country. So we've got another collection here of European countries. Now, we only obviously have the 4 that we've set up in the taxonomy, but this could be however many it is these days, 30 plus. And again, that might be useful in a particular part of the business. You could have as many collections, defining as many subsets of things as you need for use of different use cases in different parts of your business. So you can slice and dice your knowledge graph in many ways, and that's quite powerful. Now, there's not only one way to organize this information, even in your graph. So just going back to our list of taxonomies again, and into this time footwear. So here we have a small list of different kinds of footwear, and we'll go into trainers. Now, I call them trainers because I'm quite old. I'm sure the younger generation probably have different names for them, and obviously depending on where in the world you are, you will have different names potentially for them too. Now, we only have 2 values on screen here to keep it simple, but the interesting point about this screen is that we have an alternative label called Gutties, and I did a bit of Googling to find this out, but essentially on the right we have this little Excel tag. Now, what this is telling us is here we are dipping in to SCOS Excel. So that's an extension to SCOS that goes an extra mile in terms of the kind of sophistication you can add. So generally labels are just strings, and there's nothing more you can say about them, which is maybe fine for many use cases, but there are certainly use cases where it's useful to be able to say things about the actual labels that you give to things as well. So if we go through to Gutties, here we are. Here we're actually looking at the label and it as an entity in its own right. So concepts are one kind of entity in this instance, but labels are another kind of entity. And in this instance, the interesting thing here is we've used our ontology again and the property used in country to say, and you can see it down here at the bottom right of the screen, that the term Gutties generally is used in Northern Ireland. I think it's also used in Scotland as well. But what it allows us potentially to do is to say, well, hey, this label is not only it's in English, but if we've got users in, say, Northern Ireland, we may see this term, or we may want to display this term on our site or in our searches or in our faceted lists. And so we can localize the graph to a particular person's context that they are working within. So that's very powerful. Another example might be to target a label for a certain demographic. Now, Gutties may be a term that's used by maybe, I don't know, 15 to 29-year-olds. And again, you could expand your information to that kind of level so that you can target much more accurately where certain terminology is used. And the reverse, if people are using these terms for discovery, that you can kind of work backwards to work out that Gutties are actually trainers. So that gives you more power and more ability to be more user-friendly in terms of the terminology they use, but still get back to those IRIs and those unique identifiers. So we've got Northern Ireland. Let's go through to Northern Ireland. So this takes us again into to another area. So obviously, Northern Ireland is part of the UK, and we can see down here we've got what is called a broad match to the UK. So at the top we saw the UNESCO taxonomy being used, and essentially that's an external taxonomy, but it has some concepts that are similar to the concepts that we've created in our mini taxonomies, and so we may want to relate the two. And that can be very powerful, not only because those external taxonomies may connect to other systems or be used by other systems, but also just to create a richer connection and to be able to reuse that data. So in this instance, we've said that actually Northern Ireland is a match to the concept UK in the UNESCO thesaurus, and so that's quite a powerful connection that we've made there. That's a broad match. If we look at the United States of America, it's even more interesting. Because in UNESCO, they actually have a concept, the United States of America. They call it the USA. And so there's a good example there of essentially the same concept with different labels, but it's essentially the same thing. So in this instance, we've said, hey, these two things are pretty much exact matches. And in the world of SCOs, that allows us to say, well, these two things are pretty much interoperable in how we might want to use the data. So data that UNESCO defines on the USA is probably data that we can use quite safely in our world too. But the ability to have additional external taxonomies, is great, but it can also apply internally as well. If you're a big company and you've maybe grown through acquisition, or you've got legacy systems, they may have their own controlled lists, their own set of countries, for instance, and it can be almost impossible to come up with a unified view across an entire company, a large company. So this kind of approach also can be the beginning of unifying your data, so that maybe you have two different taxonomies of countries from two different systems in your business, but you can start to connect those concepts together, so that you might say that the USA and USA, or the United States of America, are actually the same thing. So you can start to move towards a kind of unified view of the world within your business. And you can see where those connections between the different systems lie. So it's powerful in that respect as well. So as a final part of the demo, because obviously we've been looking at some fairly simple taxonomies, we'll click through to the USA. Now, this is in the UNESCO Thesaurus. The UNESCO Thesaurus is pretty big. There's over 4,000 concepts in it. And it just highlights a bit more of the power of graphology, which can go up to large taxonomies and large ontologies. So what we have on screen here is more preferred labels. You can see we have Spanish, French, and Russian in this instance, and quite a considerable number of alternative labels. Now, I've seen more than that. I've actually seen, not in UNESCO, I think, but I've seen over 100 alternate labels in some taxonomies. So there can be huge numbers of these things. And then you've got other relationships within UNESCO. Oddly, they seem to only define Hawaii as the only narrower concept of the USA, which I don't know what happened to the rest of the US. But we've got some other interesting relationships. So the USA is related to Puerto Rico. So they've started to build these connections. And there's even a concept of OECD countries. And obviously, there'll be a talk from OECD later. So there are interesting aspects there. And just to show you some of the other information you can see about the concept in here. So if you're interested in the raw data underneath that you might have in Graphology, and you might end up putting into, say, MarkLogic, this is the kind of actual raw data under the covers that we are seeing in the printed display. These are triples, so it's actual RDF displayed in a table. The other important aspect for many taxonomists is an audit trail of and the governance aspects of your taxonomy. So here we can see that when I added this relationship, we can see that I've created an exact match to what is the concept of USA in our small taxonomy. And that's an important part potentially of tracking how your taxonomy has changed over time. Taxonomies, they're not static things necessarily. Many are never finished, and they do grow. And so change and knowing how they've changed is an important part of that. And all of that, again, is part of the graph, and you have access to that information. So you can download the history at this level or various other levels, for instance. And on that question of change, so you need somebody, as James said, ideally you have a taxonomist or somebody who looks after your data. You don't want to just leave it dead in one corner. Buried in a spreadsheet in many circumstances. And so if you've got a tool like Graphology, you've got it in a standard format, and you've got the tools to help you manage it and also govern it. And part of that governance can be allowing others to view and make suggestions for changes to that taxonomy. So there is a life cycle, and it may be that subject matter experts make suggestions to the taxonomist for changes, and those could come from various parts of the business. And I think we have one of our customers I think they're probably somewhere around a dozen to 15 subject matter experts are contributing to their taxonomy, and a taxonomist is in charge of coordinating that and discussing it. And you can do all of that discussion within Graphologi itself, and it's all real time as well. As James mentioned, that Graphologi it's like Google Docs. Everybody sees all the changes each other is making in real time. That governance aspect can be really quite important. And so between history and life cycle, that is tooling that many people need and want to see. So there are a couple of other bits I just want to show you, just to finish off. So obviously you can have more information about the taxonomy itself. Interestingly, UNESCO has the title in 4 different languages. But there are 2 other important aspects. So the statistics is, information you might want to see. And we can see here that UNESCO has over 4,400 concepts and in various preferred labels. And interestingly, you can see that for some reason, Russian seems to be missing about 35 labels. So that information could be quite important, and how you're breaking down and you're maintaining your taxonomy, especially obviously if you're looking for gaps in certain markets that you're targeting or certain languages. Then you have the other sort of governance aspect around quality. Now, Graphologi, for the most part, controls what you can do, and there are many rules that SCOs apply, and Graphologi implements all of that to stop you doing certain things. But if you import data, Graphologi doesn't stop you importing certain things that break those rules. But you need to be able to check the quality, and that's an important part of a taxonomy. And so this is actually the quality check running on the UNESCO, and you can see that actually there are some violations of the SCOs rules. In this instance, they've got the same preferred label on different concepts, which is not supposed to happen in a SCOs-based taxonomy. So there are all these various tools that help you manage your taxonomy and get it right, and that's an important part of the overall process. And then obviously you can export it and you can integrate with other systems. So just to summarise, really, we're very much fans of starting small and building, and start with your identifiers, your taxonomies, add some ontologies in there, maybe use SCOs Excel if your use cases go to that level, and start to build all that. And that can be the foundations of building a really good knowledge graph. And then there's all those other things that James mentioned that you'll see in future talks. Okay.
Wonderful.
And back to you, I think, James. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. That's really good, really interesting. And I think, the thing that excites me about Graphologi is the UI is so clean and neat and easy to understand. So for me, I think it's a really powerful tool for getting started and getting people going. I don't know that you guys mentioned it, but it's software as a service. So you can sign up online and start to get going with it straight away. So again, one of the barriers that we've seen is lots of people getting worried about starting down this journey of using taxonomy tools and semantics. Well, you can get going with one of these tools pretty quickly, and you've all got MarkLogic, or put it on your laptop and start to bring those things together and get going.